Evening, everybody, and welcome to this Anglo-Israeli Association event. I'm going to be your chair this evening. My name is Richard Sloggett. Between 2018 and 2019, I was the Special Advisor on Policy Issues to the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. I now run a policy institute here in the UK called the Future Health Research Centre. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's webinar on the very important topic of PTSD and anxiety, survival behaviours, teamwork and resilience. Even before COVID-19, we were living in some difficult times, from the innumerable stresses and strains of modern life and the mixed blessings posed by the immediacy of digital technology through to the recent political upheaval and economic uncertainty. There is little doubt that our mental health is increasingly being put under strain. The question is, how do our brains cope with all of that is being thrown at us, and why do some struggle more than others? To discuss this important topic this evening, I have three excellent panelists. We have Professor Rony, who is the head of the Department of Neurobiology at the Weizmann Institute of Science. Welcome, Rony. I also like to introduce Professor Neil Greenberg, Professor of Defence Mental Health at King's College London. Good evening and welcome, Neil.
Good evening.
And last but certainly by no means least, we have Professor Sir Simon Wessely, the Professor of Psychological Medicine at King's College London. And Simon and I met when he was completing his Mental Health Act review in 2018. So I'm delighted to welcome everyone on this call for what I'm sure will be an excellent discussion. I'm going to let each of the speakers do a short presentation each. And if you have questions, please do post them in the Q&A chat. And then what I will do after each presenter has presented is facilitate a discussion based on those questions. If I may, Rony, I'm going to start with you, and I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. Rony, over to you.
Good to me. Okay, I'm first. Good. So let me share my screen and just again. Technology is always a problem for scientists, for advanced scientists like ourselves. Okay, do you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Good. So I'll start. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's a pleasure. I think it's going to be an exciting discussion. So I think my talk might be slightly different than the others, but I'll try to squeeze everything we do in the lab and maybe at Weizmann into 15 minutes, which I doubt I can make it. I always take longer, but I'll do my best. So I'm Rony from the Weizmann Institute. I'm currently the chair of the Department of Neurobiology. And in my lab, we try to look at the brain and kind of in a machine-like approach or computer-like approach, trying to understand how does the brain compute things and generates behavior. And for the topic of today, we all know, and I'm sure my esteemed colleagues will emphasize this after me, so I'm just going to do it briefly, that in the past 40 years, we've seen a huge increase all across the world, especially in modern societies and, in first world countries. And that means PTSD, depression, and anxiety. I apologize for the example I'm going to give from the US. I know that giving examples from the US in a UK presentation is almost unheard of, but that's data from the NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health. And currently, mental and substance abuse disorders are on the third place in terms of taking a toll on human lives and societies. And it's getting even worse as we speak. And obviously, the last year has been a good example. COVID-19 is still ongoing, but I think we can pretty safely say that a long-term second pandemic from the COVID-19 is going to be that of mental health. There are many long-term effects from solitude, loss of job, stress, etc. I think it's all pretty intuitive. And I'll be careful here because I'm sure there are many people in the crowd that do amazing job in helping PTSD and anxiety. But at least from a scientific perspective, from basic science perspective, there's been no real change in treatment in the past 30 years. It's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and derivatives, but no major understanding of the basic mechanisms And I would say that one way forward, I wouldn't say the only way, but one way forward is definitely basic research, and that's what Weizmann is all about. A good example for why to invest in basic research is actually the recent years. 40 years of messenger RNA has led us to be able to develop a vaccine in record time. That wouldn't be, it's not just the pharmaceutical companies that made a beautiful job in the past year. It's actually the scientific world or the academia, if I may give ourselves some credit, that in the past 40 years have led us to be able to do this. So we want to understand how the brain generates adaptive behavior. And for this, I'll just do a little bit of publicity because I'm very proud of it. I'm currently in charge of putting this thing together. We're setting up a new Institute for Brain and Neural Sciences in which we'll have several centers, and maybe one of the major ones is going to be one about mental and emotional health. We're going to have a new building for that. It's a beautiful project. But let's move to the topic of today, which is anxiety and post-trauma, and that's really the focus of my lab. And so we know that we live in age of anxiety. Again, I apologize. These are examples, I think most of them from US literature, but journals, but I think it captures the same spirit all around the world. Anxiety and post-trauma and depression are increasing. I think somewhere here there's even a point where, yeah, an epidemic greater than depression. It's almost a competition between depression and anxiety. Who gets to be a bigger epidemic, which obviously we need to solve both and not fight who's winning. And in my lab, we take a physiological approach and we try to understand how does adaptive learning can result in anxiety and post-trauma, and we focus on the primate amygdala prefrontal circuits. And so very briefly, we had the amygdala, which is a very small, relatively small structure. Kind of, if you go from your ear inward, you'll hit the amygdala from the ear and from the eye where the crosses where the amygdala is. We know it's highly evolved in primates. You can see the example on the right. We have it circled in red in the rat, in the cat, in the monkey, and then below in humans. It actually grows with evolution compared to other structures. You can see the black nucleus there just as comparison. It's actually correlated with the prefrontal cortex, the hallmark of evolution. It has a tight connectivity, and almost in any psychiatric condition, and definitely in affective disorders like depression, anxiety, and post-trauma, there's malfunction, abnormal functionality in amygdala and amygdala prefrontal networks. And so where I come from, we take, I call it an evolutionary adaptive learning approach, which is any behavior that makes sense in light of evolution. These are all behaviors that if you look at them evolutionary wise, they make complete sense. But when they go to the extreme, they can result in extreme maladaptive responses such as anxiety and post-trauma. And I'll give you example in the talk now. One of them is resistance to extinction. The other is spontaneous recovery. Another is overgeneralization, exploitation. And when I go over them, I'll explain why each of them is on one hand evolutionary, very reasonable for the animal to survive, but in cases which we do not yet fully understand, they go to the extreme and hence result in post-trauma and anxiety and depression. That the case is the way my lab and myself think about it. And so I'll start with, I'll go very briefly over a list of studies. I'm sure many graphs are going to be maybe less fully, and it will be hard to understand them in the pace I'm going to go over them, but I'll do my best and try to give you the gist of what we're doing. So first is memories that resist extinction. If you experienced a traumatic event, even just seeing the Twin Towers collapse, people, we know we have many that suffered from post-trauma. And the question is, why doesn't it just go away? Extinguish is the clinical or comes from cognitive psychology terminology. And one hypothesis we had based on a lot of literature is that if the event has an uncertainty component to it, if it's surprising by any way, it will lead to a memory that resists extinction. And so we replicated this in the lab, working with, in this case, with non-human primates, and we were able to show that this is indeed the case. So if you condition aversive memory, and it's expected, the animal can expect when it's going to come, then it'll be very easy to extinguish this. It'll be very easy to extinguish this. But on the other hand, if the memory is sometimes, if the aversive reinforcer sometimes comes, sometimes does not, and the animal cannot make sense of how to predict whether it's going to come or not, then it's going to be extremely hard to extinguish the memory. And the physiological hypothesis we had was that this belongs to communication between the amygdala, you see it down here, and on the right and down, and the anterior cingulate cortex, an area that I mentioned earlier that projects to the amygdala. And the reason is that the anterior cingulate cortex kind of tries to make sense of a statistical world and participates in everyday learning. And when it can, it lets the amygdala learn and enables extinction. When it cannot make sense of the world, when there's a lot of uncertainty and surprise, it kind of, to put it in simple terms, get confused, does not provide the correct input, and hence there's higher communication between the cortex and the amygdala as it always tries to make sense of the world, and that builds stronger connections, and it is therefore harder later on to extinguish the memory. And you see in the middle to the right, even the correlation between how much these two regions were correlated during the learning. When I say correlated, I mean we measured the activity of single spikes and did a correlation between how much activity, you can see it on the left in those very colorful panels, how much there was a correlation in the activity between the two regions. And the more there was a correlation in the activity, the harder it was to extinguish the memory later on. We later relied on models coming from reinforcement learning and showed that teaching signals called prediction errors go from the amygdala to the cingulate cortex and enable this. This is a different topic which I can discuss later. And so with this, after this finding, we try to understand whether it's really between inputs from the cingulate cortex to the amygdala. This was enabled by optogenetic techniques in rodents, which allow us to investigate exactly the specific pathway, and that is what we found, that it is this exact pathway, and with stimulating it, we can actually enhance extinction. Now that's all good and well, we can maybe enhance extinction, but as most of the clinicians know, one major problem, especially in post-trauma, is that of spontaneous recovery. You do a clinical therapy, it works extremely well, the patient or the subject goes home, and 1 year later, suddenly there's spontaneous recovery of the traumatic memory. And so with the physiological hypothesis we had, we actually did a test in primates again, and we were able, by using low frequency stimulation, which is designed to reduce excitability in the cingulate cortex, in the prefrontal cortex, we were able actually to prevent the return of the aversive memory that was learned a few days before. And again, there was a correlation in physiology and behavior. So the amount to which we were able to reduce excitability in the cingulate cortex actually predicted how much we would be able to avoid spontaneous recovery a few days later. And that's because it was done in primates, that there are several benefits for this kind of low frequency stimulation. We're now doing this in clinical trials in humans with collaboration with neurosurgeons, and we think it has very promising results, obviously, still have to be tested. So that's one model. Another model I'm going to talk about is memories that overgeneralize. And the evolutionary rationale again here is very clear: better safe than sorry. If you hear something that sounds like a lion, better run away and not wait to see whether it was really a lion or something that just sounded like a lion. you have more to lose than you have to gain. And so and we showed again in a line of studies that this is not just a better safe than sorry. It's not a rational decision, as any clinician working with post-trauma would, I think, agree to. We show that it's really perceptual learning. And so there are really perceptual identification discrimination thresholds that change during aversive learning. And that means that if you could discriminate two sounds before, after one sound was conditioned with a highly aversive thing, you will not be able to discriminate them later on. Again, this is kind of an evolutionary strong mechanism that makes sense and help to generate a flight or flight response. But in the modern world where we have too much, it can lead to post-trauma. We did a series of studies in subjects and in anxiety patients, and what we found is indeed that there's wider generalization. Think about the example on the upper right. People after anxiety patient, these are generalized anxiety patients, actually generalize more and respond more to cues that are less similar than the original aversive traumatic memory. And we were able to localize this to activity in the amygdala and show again that amygdala here is responsible for the overgeneralization. We were also able to show this in single cells in electrophysiological recordings. And the last part I'm going to mention today, and I have no track of time, so one of you should signal me like 2 minutes or something. Okay, thanks. Is what we call the exploration exploitation dilemma. Now that's something we all face on a daily basis. Do you want to go to your favorite restaurant, or do you want to try the new one? There's obviously, this is a trivial example, but if you think about it, it goes all the way from choosing a job to choosing a spouse. God forbid, my wife is in the other room. She cannot hear me, so that's good. But you have to make some choice whether you settle on what you have, which is great, or you continue to explore and find maybe there's something better around the world. And so we hypothesize that anxiety would actually affect exploration. Again, I think it's intuitive to any clinician. And that's basically what we found, is that trait anxiety actually correlates nicely with exploration. So the higher the trait anxiety, the higher those exploration. And if you look at that, you can see the famous inverse U function that shows that if you have too less anxiety, your overall performance is not good. If you have too much anxiety, also your overall performance is not good, and that's because of the too much exploration. We were able in fMRI studies to localize this to 2 brain regions, and with a set of computational modeling, which is obviously, I don't have time to explain right now, we could find and identify the brain region that show a trade-off. And so in anxiety patients, they care less about their value, but they care more about uncertainty in the environment. And the balance between the two actually leads them to do more exploration and therefore harms their activity. Very briefly, I'm going to say something about the project that we're now pushing very hard, and that's comparing the neural codes across species. I think it has a huge potential. I'll explain shortly why I think it is. And so we look at the amygdala and the cortex, and we use recordings in Parkinson patients, in DBS studies, deep brain simulation studies, in epilepsy patients to identify the locus of the epilepsy. And we compare this to recordings from our lab in non-human primates. And what we can see is that across evolution, the amygdala is kind of responsible and being more robust, which makes sense if you want to produce a reliable fight or flight response. And the cortex becomes more rich, has a wider vocabulary. And that means, at least that's our hypothesis now, that as humans, we gained a lot of richness in vocabulary, but we lost a lot of robustness in the amygdala and compared to other animals. So there's a trade-off we pay, and I think that it's a very promising route, still at early stages. So take-home message is that we look at different models, resistance to extinctions, spontaneous recovery, overgeneralization, exploration, exploitation, and we think all of them has something to contribute to post-trauma and anxiety, and these are all somehow localized in the amygdala cingulate interactions. And the vision of my lab, and it's not even a vision because we're actually doing the first experiment these days, still in non-human primates, but we're gonna, with collaboration with neurosurgeon, to continue to even human clinical trials, and is to close the loop. You have behavior, we record activity, we, in a sophisticated way, understand the neural code, modulate the activity either via optogenetics, which is not yet possible in humans, but we can still test it, or electrical stimulation, and kind of fix the network imbalance, and so to restore balance specifically between the amygdala and the cingulate, and hopefully restore adaptive behavioral responses. And I guess my final word is what my father always taught me, that poor people cannot afford buying cheap products, and that, or the longest way around is the shortest way home. And what I'm trying to say by this is that we do need to invest, in my view, in what I call basic research to understand how these disorders actually come about in the complex brain, and take the time to understand them fully, and so develop better treatments for the near future, I hope. Thank you.
Brilliant, Ronnie. Thank you very much for that really stimulating talk and starting point for discussions this evening. We've had a couple of questions starting to come through, and I've got a couple, but what I suggest we do is I hold those back for after the other two speakers have spoken. If I could ask you, Ronnie, to just remove sharing your screen, and then I'm going to ask Neil, as the second speaker tonight, to kick off. Neil, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, and hopefully, can you see that screen okay?
We can, yes.
Okay, well, that's good. Right, so that was a really interesting talk, but I'm going to take a slightly different tack. Just to say, I'm ex-military, did 23 years in the Royal Navy. I do lots of bits and pieces of research work, and I chair the Royal College of Psychiatrists Occupational Psychiatry Special Interest Group. The reason I say that is I'm very interested at the interface between where does traumatic stress hit organizations, and what can organizations do about it. And so in terms of what trauma is, if I were to tell you that we're all going to go down on a nuclear submarine a bit later for a bit of a trip round, and I spent 7 months of my life on one of these big beasts, you know, some of you might regard that as being traumatic. Other people like me would get quite excited about it. And so sometimes it's hard to know quite whether one person's trauma is another person's excitement. And what we can't do is assume that people's experience of trauma is the same. It's very different for lots of reasons that are far too complex to go into in 15 minutes. But we know that the definition of a traumatic event actually involves things happening. So this comes from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, Volume 5, which, as you probably know, is a good textbook. And if you can't sleep, a couple of pages of that just before bedtime is far more effective than sleeping tablets. But as well as things actually happening, we also have things that are threatened. So trauma can occur when actually there is no bad event, but there is something which absolutely could have been bad if it went wrong. And as well as seeing and witnessing it, we've learned more over the last 10, 15 years about actually people who routinely get exposed to trauma in their day-to-day work. And obviously the military is an example, but so are child social workers, many staff, you know, who work in intensive care at the moment, and a whole range of other organizations who actually deal with trauma on a day-to-day basis. And I'm not going to go through the whole definition of what PTSD is, but the key thing I want to point out here is that having symptoms by themselves does not make you ill. They have to be functionally significant. So they have to actually stop you doing things. Just experiencing symptoms is quite normal. This is a nice slide, and it comes from the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And what this is a group of people who were subject to armed robbery, which I think we would agree is a reasonably traumatic event. And what you can see here is a number of weeks since the armed robbery, and this isn't the percentage of people who have lots of those symptoms, can't stop thinking about it, they're avoidant, they're jumpy, and the like. And you can see straight away after a traumatic event, around 60% of people have lots of symptoms, but it also means that 40% don't. So isn't that strange that the first thing that you might think about after an armed robbery might be, I wonder what's for dinner, or my shoes are a bit tight. Not everybody runs around like you see on the movies and screens. But you can see here, lots of people do have symptoms, and in most cases, those symptoms recover over a period of 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks. And then you're left with this persistent group of people here, in this case, about 10%, who have a problem, which is probably PTSD. And that's important because these people here are having very normal reactions to a traumatic event. We'll come back to that a bit later. And from an organizational point of view, I'm not going to touch on all of this because it's a big subject, and Simon will probably touch on some of it too. But we can think about this in terms of how do we prevent people becoming unwell, how do we detect them early on, and then how do we get on and actually provide them treatment, which obviously Rony has talked about a little bit. We know there's very strong evidence for social support. And so actually having a team of people who actually believe that the other members of the team have your back is really important. And we can actually increase the chance of people supporting each other by, rather than saying, oh, just chat to each other, we can say, right, actually, Simon, Neil, I want you to look out for each other on the shift and actually check in with each other every hour. That's part of your job. So we can actually try and make sure social support happens because it's part of what we expect. And certainly lots of emergency services teams, certainly in healthcare settings, military, that actually good teams look out for each other. And that's important, not just for them to do a good job, it's also important for their mental health. But the biggest bang for your buck in terms of traumatic stress symptoms and prevention comes from the relationship between individuals and their immediate line manager, their supervisor. So this is a study we did of British troops in Afghanistan in 2010. We surveyed about 1,500 of them, and we asked them about their perception of their immediate leaders. And you can see here what we meant by a good leader. You know, for instance, a good leader doesn't accept extra duties to impress their seniors. Overall, in these troops in Afghanistan, just less than 3% of them probably have PTSD. That's not surprising, they're in a war zone. But these are troops who felt their immediate supervisor was supportive and good, and these are troops who felt that they weren't. There is a 10-fold difference in the rates of probable PTSD. Now, this is cross-sectional data, so we can't prove causation, we can only prove association. But the effect of a good supervisor is really, really important in terms of who develops PTSD or not. What does this matter? Well, great study done in Australia by some of our colleagues in fire station managers. And they train these fire station managers how to have what we call a psychologically savvy conversation. So to be able to speak to their staff. And as you can imagine, Australian firefighters probably are not the most psychologically minded individuals you might meet. But the idea here was to train them up so they can have discussions. And the idea was to increase their confidence. Got published in the Lancet Psychiatry, and they showed that for every £1 invested in that training course, it saved £10 in sickness absence in the following 6 months. So again, this 90%, 1/10 response, the same as we found with the military supervisors. So this is a really big effect. We've done something very similar to this with our NHS, where we've done some really short manager training. This lasted 1 hour over Zoom, just like this, with a bit of practice involved. And what we're able to do is to show that with a 1 hour training session, we increase managers' confidence from before doing it to afterwards. And afterwards, nearly 85% of managers said they felt confident. And that's a 1 hour training package. So to give people these skills and get them practicing, it doesn't take necessarily very much. One big topic that I'm not going to go into any detail, but Simon may touch on, is screening. And lots of organizations use psychological health screening to either try and work out who should be doing difficult tasks, or importantly, also who gets affected. US military may have screened 2 million people probably over the last 20 years. And I will leave Simon to come and talk about that a bit later. Another thing we know makes a difference is to try and use this social support to make a difference to people who are being traumatized. And the British military have invested a lot of time and effort and research work into this program called TRIM, Trauma Risk Management. And what this works on the principle of is that after a traumatic event, when you say to military personnel, who did you speak to about that traumatic event? 97% said, I spoke to people like me, who are on the same deployment, have the same language. Only 8% speak to people like me, to mental health professionals and the like. So mostly the support that people seek is from people just like them, their buddies. And so what TRIM still is a program where we train up frontline professionals to have conversations with their colleagues, not to counsel them or to try and debrief them or any of that sort of stuff, but to try and spot these 10 risk factors. And they do it a few days after the event. They do it again about a month later. Remember that graph I showed you? You spot a lot of distressed people at first. That's okay. You manage them. You increase their support. You decrease their pressure. You check again a month later. If they're still distressed, you then get them forward to go and see a mental health professional, because we know people don't seek help. And actually, if they've recovered, which many of them will have done, you say, well done, that's great, off you go on your way. So this is a way of actively monitoring people, which is what NICE suggests. They're not group counsellors. They don't go around giving people hugs, although some of our Royal Marine colleagues do some strange stuff that we won't talk about. But this is not a pink and fluffy type approach. This is colleagues sitting down, having a proper conversation. And when I was in the military as a psychiatrist, I got lots of my badges and all the rest of the stuff. But when I turned up, everyone said, the psychiatrist is here, oh, the psychiatrist is here. But when a sergeant turns up who looks the same and speaks the same sort of language, they'll sit down with the sergeant and have a cup of coffee in the way that they won't do that with me. We've now done 13 academic papers on TRIM, and this is not penicillin for trauma, but it's very well researched. It improves social support, it increases help seeking, and we've got some data also showing it improves organizational efficiency and decreases sickness absence. So it's a pretty credible system, and importantly, it doesn't do any harm, which I know is a strange thing to say, but it's really important in the world of interventions that we don't do any additional harm. And talking of additional harm, we come on to the topic of psychological debriefing, which is the idea that after a trauma, you call in a trauma specialist or a psychological counsellor to come and deliver some sort of intervention. I'm not sure if you can see here, there's two cowboys saying, "Half to help me," could be buzzards, could be grief counsellors. Now, there's nothing wrong with grief counsellors. There absolutely is a place for them, but it's not in the immediate aftermath of a trauma. And our national guidance very specifically says, do not do psychological debriefing. Now, for those of you who don't know much about NICE, NICE is our national body, NICE very rarely say don't do something. I was on the NICE PTSD panel. We had, for instance, applications for evidence to do with dolphin swimming and PTSD. And swimming with dolphins may or may not treat PTSD. It's probably quite nice to swim with dolphins, but there just isn't very much evidence. So NICE don't say don't do dolphin swimming. NICE just don't say anything at all on dolphin swimming. For NICE to say don't do psychological debriefing is because the evidence is that on balance, not only does it not help, it causes additional harm. So we're very clear that in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, we don't want psychological health experts coming in. We want the team to support itself with good managers and good peer support. And NICE are very clear, keep an eye on people and check in with them. And then we come on to treatment that I won't talk about in any great detail. So my bit that I'm trying to put across here is that actually it's inevitable that lots of people will develop symptoms after a traumatic event. That's very normal. Mostly they recover without any difficulty. However, unfortunately, the ones who do become ill, the important minority, are unlikely to seek help. And actually the best way that organizations can manage traumatic stress is by having really good relationships between peers and between individuals and their supervisors. And that actually, this is a bit of a cheesy phrase, I know, but within organizations, I strongly believe that resilience doesn't lie in individuals, it lies in the bonds between them. And therefore, what we need to do is to find better ways to strengthen those bonds and to keep an eye on people who might have been traumatized so we can get them to get the correct treatments if unfortunately they develop an illness. So that's me. I will stop my screen sharing and let Simon.
Brilliant. Neil, thank you very much indeed for that really stimulating talk. And there's some questions popping up in the chat, which we will come back to after I've handed over to Simon Wessely to give his opening remarks tonight. Simon.
Great, thanks very much. So 2 pieces of good news for you folks. I believe that PowerPoint after 7 o'clock should be illegal, and it's 1 minute past 7, so no PowerPoint. The second piece of good news is Neil, who I've worked with for 20 years now, has just given my talk. So that's the second bit of good news for you. So I'm very familiar with all that research. So all I'm going to do is tell one story, and then I'm going to involve you, Richard, in a quick game. Okay. So first of all, Neil's talked about screening, and that is a very important subject. And we've been working on this together for years and years and years. And we showed some time ago now that it's a very, very seductive thing, isn't it? And every time you give evidence to politicians, you will know this, Richard, that you go to our House of Commons Select Committee and some MP will stand up and immediately berate you and say they have a constituent who has had a terrible time in the military. And when they got and read his medical notes, they discovered that he'd had an awful background, that his father was a drunkard, that he'd had trouble with the police, he had a bad disciplinary record at school, and he was an accident waiting to happen. And after he came back from Iraq, he did a terrible thing, either to himself or someone else. And what an outrage it was that he was allowed to join the military. Now, we already knew that there were problems with this, and I could have spoken all day, and my background, I should say, is in epidemiology. So I'm a psychiatrist clinically, but I'm an epidemiologist. And about the only great thing about COVID is now I don't have to say what epidemiology is, because actually everybody knows. Indeed, half the population think they are epidemiologists, but we do big studies. And we'd already shown that that the MP was wrong, because we could show that for every person like this that we would identify, and we could identify, and would then not send to war. But we showed that before the Iraq War, where we screened everyone in British forces Germany for these attributes, did nothing with the data. They went to war, and we looked to see who had broken down. And that MP was correct. The kind of person that he had described was much more likely to, well, not much more likely, but was more likely to break down. The only problem was, for everyone who, like him, who we would have stopped, we would have stopped 5 others who were identical and who didn't break down. Now, you can't get MPs to understand that. It's impossible. So what I do always would say to them, that's absolutely right, but I just want to say to the MP, so you're from a garrison constituency, can you think of anyone else like the chap you've just described? Similar, from the same estate perhaps, with a drunken father, a real terrible pain in the arse for you as the constituency MP, you knew the family, etc., but who joined the army. What happened to them? Say, oh, well, actually, yes, I can. Absolutely, yes. Now there was so-and-so. He did very well, came back as a sergeant major, gave him a medal a few days ago. Yes, splendid fellow. Oh, there's a couple of others as well. Army really did a great deal of good for them. And I said, well, we would have stopped them as well. And at that point, they shut up. So that's the only way of getting people, policymakers, to understand the fundamental principle of screening for psychiatry is it doesn't work. Now, you could say, what about when they come home? That makes a bit more sense, because now they've had the events. Because the other problem with before they go is you don't know what's going to happen to them. And as we've heard, the event itself plays a major part, but we don't know what that's going to be. So what about if they come back? Now, that makes a little bit more sense. So we set up literally the only randomized controlled trial, because I'm an epidemiologist, we do big things. This is 10,000 people, our soldiers coming back from Afghanistan, and we randomly allocated them to be screened or not screened. And it was all paid for by the Americans. It's paid for by the Americans, not because they like us, but because they can't do this kind of study, because for them, it's mandated. Okay, they're not able to do it. In fact, it was Senator Clinton, Hillary Clinton, who brought a bill through Senate mandating psychological screening. And some of them wondered, well, does it work? I'm not entirely sure. I'll tell you what, we'll get the Brits to do it because they don't do it. So we did all this, and then I presented the first set of results at Royal Hospital, Chelsea, to the Secretary of State for Defence there. He was, in fact, sacked by Trump about a few days later, actually. But anyway, at that point, he wasn't. In fact, he was the VA Secretary, in fact, anyway. And so it was before him, and I said, thank you so much for funding the study. And he said, yeah, how did it go? And I said, I can't do accents. So I went to his accent. I said, well, we got a good result. Good result, that's great, a good result, that's what we want. Now, the problem is, a politician's definition of a good result is not the same as an academic's. And for an academic, a good result is a definitive result. So then I presented the data, and it absolutely did not work at all, in any shape or form. No matter what you did with the data, it was the most colossal failure in the history of randomized controlled trials. It absolutely did not work. We shouldn't do it. This was as definitive a result as you could get. And he was right by me, because it was a small room, and I could hear his reaction. And he started swearing. He said to he had his staffers around him, as they do. You're looking nostalgic for the old days, Richard. I can see it already. And he was saying, did we fund this? I said, yes, sir, yeah. Why did we effing fund it? I said, I don't know, sir. It wasn't us. I said, did we know this? No, sir, we didn't. And then he said, what the F are we going to do about this? And so I finally stopped and said, you've now demonstrated the great rule of screening. Once you've started a screening program, you cannot stop it. This is why we do randomized controlled trials, and why we have organizations like NICE to protect us from the terrible mistake you've made, that you are spending $100 million a year on a program that doesn't work and you can't stop. I was a little bit more polite than that. Anyway, so we talked about this. And so he then went back to the States, and we wondered what he was going to do with this result. So Richard, can you guess what he did? You're a politician, or you're not really, but you've been around them. What do you think he did with the result?
So he either ignored it, if he was able to,
yeah,
or he found something else in it which he was able to use.
He did it. He in fact did both. What he did was they welcomed the results, but they said, however, the study was done in England with British soldiers, and British soldiers are different. So that's what he found. And I wrote to him, I wrote to his staff and said, at what point did you realize that we were British? When King's College London, that might have helped a bit, or when we argued about the exchange rate, or our cute little accents when we came over. Anyway, we never heard from them again. So that's the rule of screening, never start. Now then, I just want to share the screen for a moment, please. Yakov, can you just share the screen? Richard, when it comes up, I want you to say, who's this?
Yeah, that's General Sir Arthur Sloggett.
Ah, yes. Could he possibly be a relation?
Distant relation from the First World War.
He is indeed. What was his job, Richard?
So he was the Army Surgeon General at the Battle of the Somme.
He absolutely was. And indeed he was the Army Surgeon General and then Director General of Army Medical Services for the whole of the First World War. A very remarkable man. And I just want to finish just thinking a little bit about what he knew about all this. To really, I want to counteract this idea we have that all we do is make progress, because a lot of what we do in this area is we go a little bit round in circles. So what did Arthur Sloggett know about what we're talking about, PTSD? Now, obviously, he didn't know the word PTSD because that hadn't been invented. And indeed, the disorders that he was seeing, he knew very well, however, that men could break down in war for psychological reasons. He knew that. He couldn't possibly not know that. By the time we get to the Somme in 1916, we were losing so much manpower for psychiatric breakdown that he had to do something about it. So he knew, this is not Blackadder, this is real history, that real people would break down under the intolerable conditions of modern warfare. Now, so he knew that. He was not seeing PTSD because, strangely enough, what they were getting was not PTSD. It was a disorder called shell shock. Now, that was not just another name for PTSD. It was a very different disorder because, again, in real life and in psychiatry, this is why psychiatry is so interesting, our disorders change over time. And his soldiers were not experiencing flashbacks, for example, the classic symptom of PTSD. So it was a different disorder, but he knew he had to do something about it. So he, together with his staff, who are very famous people actually, realized that they had to change the way this was being treated. And they brought in a new system. And instead of sending people back to the hospitals and bases back in England, the Germans were sending them back behind the Rhine and all this kind of stuff where no one ever got better, never came back to the war effort. They started treating them very quickly, so call it immediacy. They started treating them right by the as close as they could to the action, which they call proximity, and they started treating them with a rather brief psychotherapy, which was about how they were going to get better, and they called that expectancy. And this is the foundation of modern psychiatry, of crisis intervention, home intervention. All of the features of modern society began at the Somme with I thought he was actually your great-grandfather. But okay, well, we'll pretend for the moment that he was. With great-granddad, I assume he was, started all that. And Zahava Solomon in Israel has shown the evidence many, many years later, or clearly very many years later. And we have also shown that this doctrine that started then is still the best way to reduce acute psychiatric casualties in battle. Now, what else did he believe in? He did believe that actually genetics played a part in breakdown. He didn't use the word genetics because he didn't even know about genes, but he did use the phrases that we used at the time, which is about people's early upbringing, and he believed that the way that the hereditary that people had was a major influence on whether or not they would break down in war. He didn't know the mechanism, but he knew that the relationship existed. What else did he know? Well, he did believe in screening, I'm afraid. He felt that if you selected a few good men, and the phrase "the right stuff" actually comes back from World War I, not from the space program, but from World War I, if you selected the right stuff, you would dramatically reduce the rate of psychiatric battle casualties. And it took World War II and George C. Marshall before they realized actually that wasn't true. Screening didn't work. And again, as ever, we had to show that all over again in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, he knew that people would break down in battle under intolerable pressure, and that if you treated them rapidly and quickly, they would get better. But where we differ from them and where we have made progress is that he believed that if they didn't get better, and some didn't, and would stay in the mental hospitals of Germany, France, Britain, latterly the USA, for years and years, some of them for 20, 30 years, they would still be there at the start of the Second World War. He believed that that was not the cause of due to the war. He believed that if you didn't get better, then the cause was really you. And he believed that this was your character, and that you were basically a bad character. And he would use phrases like that, as most of the military did. And the change that happened in the 1980s with post-traumatic stress disorder, which came in as the Americans were struggling to cope with losing the war in Vietnam, and how did they explain the behavior of their soldiers, and how did they explain the psychiatric disorders they were developing? For the first time, they changed that, and they said that it wasn't, that this was also a long-term consequence of war. And that is why PTSD is different. It's a different disorder, but also it allows for the fact that you also have long-term problems after war as well as short-term problems. So that was the change that was made in the latter half of the century. Unfortunately, Rony is right. We have not made, we clearly are making advances slowly in our understanding of some of the things that went on in the brain at this. By the way, when he knew also that officers did better than men, the ranks, and that is something that has been found in every single study ever done ever since. It's always better to be an officer, but he believed that was because the officers had larger brains. So that's a neuroscientific explanation. Unfortunately, it's wrong, but that was what he believed for a finding that we all have. So my point I'll make then is that as we do and look at these issues, we have to remember that they've always been a bit of a balance between the neuroscientific, where we are making advances, but haven't yet developed new treatments, between the social, and Neil has talked a little bit about some of the work we've done on, so we've all done together on social cohesion and leadership, and the psychological, and we can talk a little bit about that, which is why do soldiers have lower rates of PTSD than civilians? This is to do with psychological factors and the understanding of the meaning of trauma. So it's about the biology, it's about the sociology, it's about the psychology, and actually occasionally we should pay also a little bit more respect to people like your possible great-grandfather, and instead of portraying them as kind of Colonel Blimp types or Blackadder types, to realize that they probably knew a lot more about the behavior of men under stress than most of our moderns. In a week, they probably learned that than most of our modern psychiatrists have learned in a year. So a tribute to your great-grandfather, great man, massive changes he made in Army medical services, and is not to be derided in the way that some people tend to do as we talk about that generation. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
That's very, very kind, and a terrific speech, and great to see him on the screen. And for Simon, great job if you two, of course, remember that.
Yes.
Lots of good questions coming through on the chat, and I want to give you each one to go on first. I'm actually going to come, Simon, just because you've just finished on PTSD side. Neil, you may want to come in on this as well. The question that's come in is, and Simon, you sort of touched right at the end about the predisposition towards PTSD of certain people. I wonder whether you could expand on elements of that.
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, the change that the US precipitated in 1980 was adapted quite rapidly in Israel, actually less so over here. It would turn out not to be quite as radical as was thought, because then we had to have a new set of research that showed that indeed your predisposition does matter. There is and I'm sure Rony can talk about this endlessly. There are genetic components, but then there are genetic components to all psychiatric disorders. I don't think that's a radical suggestion. And the problem with some of the predisposing factors is they're often not modifiable. So we know that we recruit people from disadvantaged backgrounds into our armed forces, and we could either just simply not do that, which would be one solution. But in the end, that would probably create far more social problems than if we do recruit them in, because most will actually then do well during their service. So there are predisposing factors. They're also much more difficult to measure. And I think we've moved away pretty much, Neil, from the idea of one of the things that Sir Arthur did believe in was the importance of character and personality, partly because it's so difficult to measure, but that's, I think, can become less of a modern preoccupation than it was 20 years ago.
And if I jump in, just add there was a very good meta-analysis done 20 years ago now nearly by Chris Bruin, who's a well-known figure. And what he basically did was to look at the risk factors for PTSD. So who develops PTSD? And you can split them into what were you like beforehand, including, character, disposition, gender, history of child abuse, have you had previous psychiatric, all that kind of stuff. What were you like? Then there's the trauma itself, how nasty was it, the like. And then there's what happens afterwards, how much support you get afterwards and how much pressure you're put through as you try to recover. And way above, it's the factors that occur after the trauma that most influence outcome. And the good news is that organizations or families, you can increase the support that people get. You can decrease the pressure they're put under. So rather than worry too much about what someone was like beforehand, if you treat them properly afterwards, which is interesting because that's where we are in COVID, certainly in the UK, I'm sure in Israel, as healthcare workers begin to get their head around recovering, it's the bit that happens now that will most determine whether they go on and develop post-traumatic growth or become ill rather than what's happened already.
I was going to ask Neil on this particular point, on this issue of healthcare workers and what they've experienced over the last 12 months or so. How well equipped do you think the healthcare system is, it could be in the UK or indeed anywhere globally, to deal with these sorts of issues? And do you see a sort of an instinct to kind of look at the military or work with people who've been in the military to tackle that?
So we've got exactly that going on now. Simon and I are running Simon's leading on a huge study with 27,000 people in it across the UK looking at healthcare workers. And I've been doing another study with a colleague on intensive care staff in particular. And what all that evidence says is, they are very affected. We can't yet know what the true long-term burden of illness will be because it hadn't had long-term yet. But we strongly think, and what we advocate and what we're doing, gathering some research data on, is that the things that work in any group of individuals exposed to trauma, like the military, will also have great relevance to the NHS. So peer support, absolutely, we're trying to get that into the NHS. Manager training, the NHS, that REACT training that I showed you in my slide, that's being rolled out across because we need managers to speak to their staff. And then the NHS also has, a heavily military influenced recovery plan. And actually, even then, I'm sorry to whittle on too much, but I'm not sure recovery is the right term because we don't want to get back to where we were. We want to get to somewhere that's better than that because it wasn't so good beforehand. So there has been an awful lot of learning from the military because the NHS doesn't do sending people on deployment for a year. It does constant grind. The military sends people away, for 6 months, does horrible stuff, and it brings them back and they paint boxes for, 2 years. That's not what the NHS does. And it's got to both recover its services, but more importantly, first of all, it has to recover its people. And that's something they're not used to doing. So yes, lots of learning.
And is there anything just on that particular point, because it is so topical, when you join the military and you go through a particular type of training, you're then exposed and you're sort of trained up for a certain type of sort of career. And in healthcare, obviously, the number of different types of careers are quite wide ranging. And what we've seen during the pandemic is people having to be quite flexible in the sort of situations and environments in which they've been working and being exposed to things that they haven't been exposed to before. How is that factored into some of the sort of models and studies that you're running at the moment? Well,
the issue of training is absolutely vital, and I noticed someone's asked that question. But the first thing is nearly all of that is about training for the job you're about to do and giving yourself the best physical protection. So confidence in your skills, your supervisor, confidence in your protective equipment, all of those things are the most, and being able to do the job properly. And that's something, would you say 95% of it, Neil? And Rony? The question is, can psychological training add more to that? And that's a vogue at the moment. I think the jury's very much out on that. We've had the saga of psychological debriefing that made you worse and stress inoculation. So I would say that's an optional extra. That's not to say that people don't need psychological treatment when they get ill, but can all the kind of mindfulness and all these courses that people have, etc., do they make a big difference? I suspect they probably don't make a very big difference when you've got the basics right.
Yeah, and I think the other thing there is about at what level. You know, if you say for the NHS, we're going to train every NHS worker in mindfulness, I think that's a complete waste of time. But actually, for some people, mindfulness is a thing that works for them, and that's absolutely fine. There's no problem in it. I think I think the thing is that one of the dangers, Simon and I were part of an international group, is that actually if you train people about symptoms they might get, you might also sensitize them to experience those symptoms. We have to be a bit cautious before we just say education's always good.
Yeah, what do you do in Israel, Rony?
Well, not in the military right now, but yeah, there's been several attempts to try and identify what would make a soldier more susceptible to suffer from PTSD. I don't think there's been much success in identifying this. And as far as I know, there is not yet a lot of attempts to characterize soldiers before whether they're going to be more susceptible to post-trauma if exposed or not. In terms of treatment afterwards, the army in Israel is obviously very experienced with this, so we do get peer support, especially for the peers themselves. But actually that leads me to a question I asked Neil, and he answered briefly, but I still want to, because I think a nice controlled experiment can be designed. And so my question was, where does the benefit from a peer or from a supervisor's comes more with a bigger impact? Is it because the supervisor or the peer are more self-confident, assuring, etc., or is it the care afterwards? And I'm sure they both. I mean, if it's before, it probably goes to helplessness, which we all know is a big issue in developing any kind of psychological trauma. And so I wonder if there's any way to characterize the balance, whether it's better to have a very confident commander, or it's better to have a very solid, good friend peer afterwards. I'm sure the answer is both, but
I think the answer is both. But if I had to just do one thing, I would put my money on the supervisor, on the relationship between the supervisor. I said that's the biggest.
You think the preparation and the behavior at the time of the trauma might be more important, like with the kid, right? If you get scared from every small thing that happens to him or her, you induce this anxiety in them. If you respond calmly, and I know it's obviously a stretch, but
I was laughing at Simon's dog rather than what you were saying.
Okay.
That's our supper has just arrived by a takeaway. We all live on deliveries at the moment, and it makes the dog bark.
I think the thing that a supervisors really can help with is about this idea of meaning making. You know, so I've just been through this terrible event. What does it mean? And as you say, you know, in a parental sense, you look to the parent to try and give an explanation. But is this something which I should be terrified about and I could have killed? Or actually, is this part about being in the military? And I think what the supervisor can do is to help develop that meaningful narrative. You know, we're in it together. We would have looked out for you. You are okay. Rather than, just crack on. You'll be okay. We'll deal with it, which isn't necessarily always helpful.
In this aspect, I guess Israel is good,
but an overconfident commander, as you alluded to, Neil, in that list of what the bad attributes, someone who's overconfident and volunteers you for meaningless missions is the worst thing you can have. Just as at the moment, managers who keep saying, well, we just got to keep going on, we're now going to deal with all the waiting lists, etc. And we can do it, Simon being the name of the head of the NHS. That's an overconfident manager, and will not have good staff relationships. We'll have a lot of sick leave.
So I could definitely keep this conversation going a lot longer, but Simon, I'm conscious of your takeaway. We are coming up to time, but I do want to ask, there's one final question that's come through, and I think it's a really good one actually, which is on the sort of general mental health of the population, and that what the long-term impact of this pandemic will be on the wider population health and resilience. Obviously, we've got structures such as the military and healthcare workers, but as societies, there's going to be some long-term impacts. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on managing that and the impact that's going to have.
I was in the FT about that yesterday. So COVID, mental health wasn't good before COVID, certainly in Britain. And I don't know so much about Israel, but certainly in Britain it wasn't. So we shouldn't have a rose-tinted view that everything was wonderful before. I was already doing lots of media on the mental health crisis before the word COVID was invented, largely among our young people. And it's among our young people that we've seen the biggest changes. And not the elderly who are more affected by COVID and more likely to die, but the young people. And today, the latest data on employment showed that they've had the biggest hit has been on unemployment. And there's been quite a substantial change in depression and anxiety in younger people. Now, I think that's partly educational, partly economic, but also the dreadful impact of social distancing on mental health. So we have the adversity, the virus does that. Then we have, in order to control the virus, we make things 20 times worse because we interfere with the natural way in which we cope with adversity, which is talking to our friends and our networks, our peers, exactly as Neil and Rony has described. And once we move away from that, I think we will see a large reduction. There will be a lot of these things will be transient. But what will then be revealed is underlying people with more severe mental disorders who we haven't really noticed because they've not come for treatment, but who've relapsed off their medication, who cannot get treatment, who have OCD, who have health anxiety, etc. Then will be revealed a smaller number, but who will be in a lot worse position.
Rony, Neil, any comments from you on that question?
I'm another UKite, so I think Rony's probably got a better view from the Israeli side.
It's hard to say. I mean, I hope Simon is right by saying that it's gonna that even the mild cases of mental health are gonna slowly go away as we go back to normal life. I'm not an expert on development. We did a little bit of studies, but I'm not the expert on that. But I'm more worried than I think Simon mentioned it, that the older population actually can cope with COVID better than we thought. And I'm more worried about the younger population, especially teenagers, maybe because I have 2 teenagers. But, you know, there are some ages where they're very, very vulnerable, and that's the essence of their life, understanding society, social interactions. Now, I don't think it's going to be a major epidemic. Like, I'm going to take it to the extreme. Not everyone is going to become completely socially incapable, but I am slightly worried, and I have no basis for concrete evidence, that there are going to be some long-term effects on the 12, 13, 14, 15 years old that underwent this year. I truly hope that Simon is correct, and it's gonna, and they're gonna, I mean, as we all know, kids and teenagers, adolescents are more flexible and more adaptive than we can ever imagine. So maybe we're just worried and they're gonna be fine. I hope so.
I think on that optimistic note, I think that's a great place in which to leave this conversation. I've found it thoroughly stimulating and really, really interesting. It's mental health, PTSD, anxiety, such an important topic. So with that, I'd like to thank our 3 panelists, Rony Paz, Neil Greenberg, and Sir Simon Wessely. Thank you to Jakob and the team at the Anglo-Israeli Association for putting this event on. And finally, thank you all for joining and for putting your questions in the chat. I'd like to close tonight and just wish everyone a very pleasant evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure, everyone.
See you soon. Thanks.
The joys of a takeaway. Okay. Bye-bye.
Enjoy it, Simon. Nice to see you.
Will do.